Hello, welcome to this NRCoP national hybrid event on the regulatory state, faults, flaws and false assumptions. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm Kerry Lever. I'm the chair of the South Australian chapter and I'm the host for today's event. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Kaurna people, traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. I also pay my respects to the traditional lands in which you are coming to us from today. I further extend my respects and acknowledge Maori as Tanata Whenua and Treaty of Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I pay my respect to Maori in attendance today. We are coming to you live from Tandanya, Adelaide, where we have a room full of engaged and enthusiastic regulators. We also have an online audience of over 200 joining us from across the country and New Zealand. Before I introduce James, a few points about our webinars. All webinars are recorded and made available on the NRCoP YouTube channel. We'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom today for our online audience to post questions to James. And we'll leave a good chunk of time at the end for those questions. If you like the look of another question, you can upvote it. If the live stream does happen to cut out, please stay with us, and the NRCoP team will be working in the background to rectify that issue and get the streaming back up as soon as we can. If your connectivity drops out, we suggest you restart your connection and then rejoin the webinar. So, on to the session for today. Regulatory state, faults, flaws and false assumptions. We're going to be discussing structural faults that face regulators. By doing so, we will highlight the key false assumptions that surround regulators and identify the design flaws that very often prevent regulators from succeeding and quite possibly set us up for failure in the first place. So now to our guest speaker, I'd like to introduce James. James is a self-labelled recovering regulator. He is also the former chair of the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, and is now the senior fellow at Melbourne University's Law School. He recently completed a term at Oxford University where he was a visiting research fellow at the Commercial Law Centre. After a career in law, finance and financial regulation, James is now working on improving regulatory systems, for which we thank you. So James, if you would like to head to the lectern. Thank you.
Great. So what I wanted to do was just quickly race through the false assumptions and flaws that I think we all operate under as regulators. I think the first starting point, and we're getting the slides up, the first starting point is to remind ourselves that regulators have the role of behavioural modification. I think part of the big problem is that many regulators forget that at the end of the day, when we strip back our roles and functions, our statutory purposes and mandates, we're in the business of behavioural change and behavioural modification. So I just wanted to check that the slides are coming through because I'm stuck on the first page. So let me just jump into a couple of other conclusions that have prefaced my work around the false assumptions and flaws. Regulation is everywhere, but yet we don't have systems that are designed and optimised from the very inception. What we have instead is a haphazard collection of different regulatory systems and different regulatory categories. And I'll come on to in a minute what I mean by regulatory systems and regulatory categories. This means that this haphazard design, we are designed to struggle to succeed. And I think it's very important that we have this diagnostic realisation in our work so that we can understand the landscape that we need to navigate. Put simply, if we are blindfolded as we walk through a field, we're going to trip over. So this is what I propose to do today, is give you a sense of that field so that we can release the blindfold and look out for the stones, the hurdles, and the crevices. And what we need is a diagnostic review of the regulatory system. And I've come to the conclusion that there are 12 fundamental flaws that are predominantly design or chronic that form these crevices and form these trips and traps for us as we go through our work. So very quickly, this gives you a sense of a regulatory category, which is the purpose by which we operate. And it's very important, I think, when we're designing a regulator to see what type of regulator we are. You know, are we safety? Are we conduct? Are we market? And so on. These categories, unfortunately, are not well defined in our constitutional construct and design as they could be and should be. Moreover, we don't think about the whole regulatory system as we should. And when I say we, I mean the broader community involved in regulation, which importantly includes the designers and builders of regulatory system, which is parliaments and governments. And this screenshot will just give you a highlight that the regulator is only one part, and albeit a very important part, of that broader regulatory system. So, racing through, because I wanted to get to comments, questions and discussion, the fault lines. First and foremost, and most things flow from this, regulatory systems are not designed from inception. Instead, what we have is designing of a rule book and a regulator without thought to that category or categories of regulation that we're trying to solve for. And secondly, without regard to the broader regulatory system, that is, all of the different component parts and participants in that regulatory system. And of course, primarily focused in the regulatory system are those who are regulated. They should consider themselves as duty holders. They are on the front line of making sure that they adhere to the regulatory system. One thing that is unfortunate in that regulatory misdesign is that there is very often a failure to have precise and clear role purposes and clarity. The more work that I do in Australia, both federally and by way of states, and also internationally, is that the statutory objectives or statutory purposes of many regulators, if not most regulators, is actually very poor. They are either very wide, parenthood statements, or they are very prescriptive. When they're prescriptive, they are often in conflict or in competition. This means that navigating what we do is difficult if our purpose and objectives is not clear. This leads to the conclusion, in my opinion, that regulators are often criticised for not doing their job because their job is actually not clearly defined. The third point, the third fault line, is that we talk about independence of regulators, but we are not clear on why that regulator should be independent or autonomous, and we are not clear when we want it to be, that is a regulator, to be independent, we are not clear on protecting that independence because there are ways and means of diluting that independence which take away from the efficiency and effectiveness of that agency. Fourth, regulators are by design monopolies. There is usually no competition in the jurisdiction or for the purposes or powers of a regulator. Now, this is a statement of the obvious, but it is unclear to me that regulators and those who oversee regulators are applying ways and means to overcome and counteract the monopolistic tendencies and characteristics that many regulators and regulatory systems suffer from. The fifth point, which leads into that last one, is that there is usually suboptimal internal corporate governance structures. That is unclear. There are either conflicts of interest, there are either imprecise delineations of roles and responsibilities between boards and commissions and executives. This diminishes the feedback loops, the improvement feedback loops that regulators operate under, and means that those monopolistic tendencies or characteristics can be entrenched and furthered. Sixth, related to the fifth point, regulators have poor external accountability structures. And essentially, the point here is that parliaments need to do a better job of oversighting regulatory agencies and regulatory systems writ large. At the moment, most, if not all, parliamentary committees are focused on ad hoc issues and not the broader picture. How is a regulator doing their job? Creating a regulatory improvement feedback loop which will better inform you as regulatory practitioners as to how to do your job and better inform the community about what job you are doing and, importantly, why you are doing it. Also, governments need to do a better job of working with and helping regulators send that message, explain what they are doing, and also hold them to account. What we are seeing, and I'll come on to this in a minute, is essentially that you are left to your own devices. You have what I call become the orphans of government. Sixth, there are very poor measurements of regulatory effectiveness. Lots of people have different views about what you should be doing and how you should be doing it, but there is no universally accepted or agreed methodology or framework that will allow you to articulate and explain, whether it be to the parliaments, to the governments, to stakeholders and the like, what job you are doing. It is a stark observation that you cannot have meaningful year-on-year comparisons of what you are doing. This also means that it is incredibly difficult, virtually impossible, for you to explain what you are doing and how you are doing it externally. And I think that lack of language, that lack of taxonomy, that lack of an ability to talk about your job limits your effectiveness and frustrates your work. Eighth, and this is a statement which will resonate. You usually have to deal with overly complex, voluminous, mostly out of date, and or frequently conflicting legislative regimes. Now, that, I'm sure, resonates with each and every one of you. 10th, and this relates back to the point I made about a broader regulatory system. There has been a failure to optimise all participants in that regulatory system. And as I highlighted in my opening remarks, in my first remarks, the first and foremost stakeholder that is not optimised is the regulated entities themselves. And this is why we need to have regulated entities as the frontline regulatory agents of the regulatory system. Think about aviation safety. Everyone involved in aviation, from the plane manufacturers to the passengers, buy into the purpose of aviation safety. This is what we need to optimise to the extent possible, and of course it has to be only done in a practical way in all regulatory systems to make sure that we are optimising, if not co-opting, those regulated as frontline agents of the broader regulatory system and broader regulatory purpose. This is why the second point about clarity of purpose and clarity of regulatory objectives is so important. If we don't have clear regulatory objectives, how can we be clear on what our regulatory expectations are of those regulated so that they can buy into that. 11th, we all know that you're operationally burdened and budget constrained. I think if we have a broader conversation with regulators and those who oversee regulators, such as governments and parliaments, about all of these fault lines, then I think it would be easier to have more constructive conversations with those who control our budgets. If we can articulate, I think, with greater confidence about our effectiveness, our role and our purpose, then I think our ability to be able to get clarity around our legislative regimes and get better funding and support will be enhanced and enabled. The 12th point is we need to think through what is commonly referred to as public service motivation and how that body of intellectual and practical work relates to regulators. Public service motivation is essentially the analysis of how we, people who operate inside the public sector, are motivated and driven. And these drivers are peculiar and unique to the public service. And how those concepts apply to regulators is really important. And I'm happy to discuss this in the question and answer, because unfortunately the body of work that has been around for a couple of decades on public service motivation doesn't dedicate enough analysis towards regulators. There's lots of analysis about teachers, doctors, medical services, and also those involved in policy. There's also work involved with law enforcement, but we regulators are somewhat lost in the middle. Let me close there. That's a very, very quick introduction, perhaps too quick an introduction, but happy to take questions. And of course, I've recently published a paper on all of this that goes into great detail that I know will be available to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was a reasonably quick gallop through, like you said, but the paper will be available to you all. I thought it might be useful to take a step back to start with and get you to talk to us a little bit more about how you happened across these flaws. When we were preparing for the session, you were telling me about regulatory effectiveness and how to measure it, and really that enabled you to expose these flaws. Could you talk to us more about that?
Yeah, thanks. It's actually a really good story, because I finished up at ASIC and it was in the midst of COVID. And those of you from Victoria will remember we were one of the most locked down parts of the world. And I sat in my study in the midst of COVID, in the midst of winter, and I thought there has to be a better way for regulators to be able to explain what we do. And I asked myself, what was the one thing that would have helped me in my work and my colleagues in my work as a regulator? And I came to the conclusion was a ways and means of measuring our performance, of measuring whether or not we were doing a good job, measuring whether or not we were effective. Because I thought from that, from having a way of doing that, then all of the other challenges, fault lines, issues, concerns could be dealt with. And because a way of measuring regulatory effectiveness would actually give us a language or a taxonomy to enable a discussion to take place between governments, between regulators, between stakeholders, between civil society, community members. We didn't have that. We don't have a way to be able to talk with a strong degree of objectivity about our work. In effect, what we are doing is talking at cross purposes because we are talking about our opinion about whether or not we're doing a good job, and they are talking about their opinion of whether or not we are doing a good job. And I came to the conclusion that what we needed, as I said, was a way of measuring our effectiveness and to take away, to the extent possible, the subjective nature of that. Now, I have a body of work that I'm focused on, which goes to exactly that challenge, where I'm trying to come up with, to the extent possible, an objective but qualitative assessment process so that we can speak with objectivity and conviction and a great degree of confidence about what we do. Absent that, we're just talking past each other. Absent that, we're just having one person's opinion against another person's viewpoint.
What I found from my most recent roles is that you can't crystal ball. You can't say, well, we prevented that harm. If we hadn't have taken that action and invested resources in that particular activity, we would have found ourselves with this awful outcome. So you're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. Could you talk to us a little bit more about what some of these measures are that you've identified through your work so far?
Well, one of the measures that I've identified, the first point is that it's difficult to measure, if not impossible to measure our work, unless we're clear on what our objectives are. This is why fault number 2 that I mentioned about lack of clarity is so important. Not only does it make for an argument, because there's no definition of what a regulatory objective is, it makes it virtually impossible for you to measure your work if you don't have a benchmark to measure that work against. This is why statutory objectives are so very, very, very important, because they not only guide you strategically and operationally, they are the benchmark to which you are or should be measured. And I would sort of ask you all now quickly to reflect on your statutory objectives. I'd hazard to guess that a lot of them are just lost in the mists of time because you're busy getting on doing your important and busy work, not worrying about the objectives, because you know what? Those objectives are not helpful. That is probably the conclusion that you're reaching. Or if you are thinking about your regulatory objectives, you're probably thinking, well, they're all competing and or conflicting, so how on earth do I navigate them? The second point is, okay, once you have a regulatory objective, hopefully, which is clear and precise, meaningful and helpful, and operationally applicable, then what are the sort of the constituent parts of effectiveness? I am a great believer that it is not about outputs, it's about outcomes. And the outcomes, of course, need to be linked to the regulatory objectives. All roads lead back to the need for regulatory objectives. But outcomes are the most important piece. How do you get to an outcome? How are you effective? And in my thinking, my reasoning, because I used to, being a person who grew up in the financial world, used to think that you could quantify everything, that you could find a quantitative response or a quantitative solution. Now, maybe with AI or better brains than mine, somebody will come up with a quantifiable solution. But until that point in time, I've now decided that we need to embrace qualitative approaches. And the qualitative approach that I propose is to look at your capability, look at your capacity, and look at your coverage. Now, we often use all of those concepts interchangeably, but it's important, and we don't have time today, maybe at another lunchtime seminar, but we need to actually identify our capability. And once we've identified our capability, do we actually have the capacity to apply that capability, and how much of our jurisdiction are we covering? So this is the framework that I've come up with, which I hope, if we use these concepts and we use these terminologies such as regulatory objectives, capability, capacity, and coverage, then we will be able to have a more informed and a more precise and meaningful and constructive conversation about our work and how we're doing it, and importantly, having a feedback loop, an improvement feedback loop, so that we can actually year on year get better at what we do.
Thank you. So one of the underpinning factors that you talk about in your paper is regulatory credibility, and how that credibility actually really links into being able to increase effectiveness. Could you talk to us a bit more about how you might, as a regulator, go about measuring your current credibility, understanding what's driving it, and how you might take some actions to try and improve it?
Yeah, so the background to the credibility point, and it was a latecomer into my 12 flaws, was that I concluded that you could have everything else. You could have great capacity, you could have great capability, but if you actually didn't have credibility, you weren't going to cover the field. And it struck me that credibility pervades everything that we do as a regulator. It's threshold. We need to be credible in what we do to be effective. Now, what I mean by credibility is to take the concepts of legitimacy and authority a step further. Legitimacy and authority are sort of the base case. They're foundational. Without them, you don't have capability. The authority is, your powers, what you've been invested to do. Legitimacy is that, you are a legitimate regulator, a legitimate part of the government concepts. And that's really important, to have those, authority and the legitimacy. But we have to take that a step further. We need to be credible in the eyes of the community and our regulated population. And credibility, people automatically think of is deterrence capability or credible deterrence. I go further than that, because that's a disincentive. That's a disincentive to break the rule. What we actually need is to think about, in addition to that disincentive, an incentive to co-opt those regulated to be a part of the regulatory system. And that's why the regulatory credibility, as I call it, is made up of a clarity and conviction of your role. It means that you need to be effective and efficient in what you do. There needs to be, as a part of the regulatory design, meaningful consequences of non-compliance, and actually an upside to compliance and adherence with the broader system. Importantly, in credibility, we need to make sure that we're effectively messaging our regulatory role and purpose. This is why, again, regulatory objectives are so important. How can you message your regulatory role if your role is unclear? How can you market that or try and persuade that to the regulatory community or regulated community if it's not clear? We also, therefore, if you have that clarity, then you can start incentivizing adherence, incentivizing or co-opting. And again, there's a number of examples which I think prove the point, which is such as airline safety. We have got to the point where there is not just a disincentive about failing to adhere, but there's an incentive to comply. Just think about many airline companies and airline manufacturers who actually use safety as a core marketing tool. That's an example of that co-option and buy-in of that regulatory purpose. That's where regulatory credibility has actually had a role to play. And again, when it comes to credibility, we need to ensure that there's accountability and responsibility by regulators. We need to be seen to be credible in the eyes of the community. We need to be seen to be answerable to the democratic institutions of government. Now, I didn't have time in my presentation, but a big part and a big conclusion of my fault lines and false assumptions is that we have now got to a point whereby regulators have separated in many respects, not all, but many respects have actually separated away from the other parts of the executive branches of government. And because of the lack of, I think, consistent, ongoing and thematic oversight and review by Parliament and parliamentary committees, regulators have gone on, many regulators have gone on to constitute a fourth branch of government. Now, when I was thinking about this, I was quite nervous about this conclusion because it's a big call. It's a constitutional call. It's above all of our pay grades, as it were. And I tentatively mentioned it to a number of different colleagues academically around the world. And by and large, they agreed and supported it. And then in my research, I found a 1937 Presidential Commission of Inquiry in the United States that concluded in 1937 that the 12 or so regulators that then existed had formed miniature independent governments in themselves, and that there had been a fourth branch of government created. In other words, this concept or this concern of regulators, if they're not properly oversighted or not properly connected to the democratic institutions of our government, will form a fourth branch of government. We need to make sure that we bring back regulators into the three branches of government, bring them back into these feedback loops, bring them back into these chains of responsibility, because that's not just good for our constitutional setup and systems of government. That's actually really important for our effectiveness and our ability to do a good job.
Fascinating that it was 100 years ago almost that was identified. One of the things that I found increases credibility is your credibility with your duty holders, your regulated entities. And if we could just draw out that point you were making about co-opting and collaborating with them to really drive behavioural change, how might a regulator go about increasing credibility through that mechanism?
Well, and it's a great question. Firstly, we need to be responsible. We're holding regulated entities and people to account. We are seen as regulators as not being held to account. This finding has been around for a very long time. The Errig report in 2003, so over 20 years ago, concluded that many statutory authorities, particularly regulatory authorities, are perceived by those regulated to be unaccountable and not responsible. That diminishes our credibility in front of those regulated persons. That's actually threshold. So in other words, it's actually good for our credibility to be seen, to be oversighted, to be held account and responsible and answerable. The second thing is that we need to, as much as we engage in the disincentives, in other words, the credible deterrence, the effectiveness of finding breaches of law, we need to also have a strategy of engagement with our regulated community to see, to the extent possible, how can we incentivize their adherence to the regulatory objectives. In other words, it's not just a disincentive strategic plan, it's a strategic plan that incentivizes adherence. incentivizes co-option and incentivizes collaboration. Now, that doesn't mean regulatory capture. That just means that we're using different levers. We're using both the disincentive against non-compliance lever, but we're also creating a lever that incentivizes compliance. And I think there's a number of examples. Professor Hodges out of Oxford University in the UK is working on a number of different examples of this, whereby looking at outcomes, engaging with the regulated population, you can look at and agree the outcomes that are good for the industry, good for the sector, and good for society. Now, obviously, we have to be concerned about regulatory capture, but we're, in many cases, a long way off regulatory capture, because what we are not doing is thinking about how to incentivize adherence, compliance. How do we get the people involved in these sectors that you regulate, how do we get them to think about adherence and achievement of the regulatory goals and objectives that you're working towards? And in my own experience, particularly in banking and finance, there's still a long way to go to make people involved in that sector start to think about, well, what is actually good for the sector? What is good for the community and the population that is served by that sector? And actually, how is that good for my business as well? Because invariably it is. And again, I use airline safety as a good example of what is good for business is also a good regulatory objective.
That gives me a good opportunity to plug the NRCoP conference. We have Chris Hodges coming to Brisbane on 27th and 28th of August. And you'll be able to hear more about his work and how that's been applied in real-world Australian cases. So I'll ask James one more question while I get the audience online to start posting their questions, and we'll start opening up from there. So we all want to take away from this, because, you know, you could sort of argue it's slightly depressing. We all have these flaws. We're all going to have some more than others. And we want to be able to work within our circle of control. And some ways in which we might get that motivation or that inspiration is from other examples. Have you seen any national or international examples you can point to where you think they've managed to get a hold of some of these flaws and take steps to minimise or remove them?
I'm very intrigued of talking to our New Zealand colleagues who I know are participating in this conversation today. I'm very intrigued about how some of the initiatives happening at the government level of creating government sponsors for regulatory systems and a recognition that regulators operate in a regulatory system is working. I think the model in New Zealand is something that could be of global application, because I've gone around the world and I've been asked this question. I was asked this very recently when I was at Oxford. Who is starting to think about this? And to the great credit, New Zealand have been thinking about this for quite some time. New Zealand is also very good at recognising the different levels of independence, and what they've done is classify, and I'm sure my New Zealand colleagues will correct me, but classify different statutory agencies as either independent, autonomous, or as crown agents. And I think that classification is really important or useful because, again, part of the fault lines is that we need to be clear on whether or not we need to be independent. Sometimes that is very, very important. Sometimes it is less important. The recognition, as I said, of regulatory systems is something that the New Zealand government and New Zealand regulators have started to do. And I think that's very, very important because we operate in a regulatory system. And I know I raced through the slides, but part of that slide that described the regulatory system included other regulators. We don't operate in a vacuum. We have cross-border, cross-state regulators, international regulators. We also have regulators inside our jurisdictions that we cooperate with. And what we need to do, and New Zealand is a good example, is that we need to think about what forms part of that regulatory system, broader regulatory system, and connect and coordinate with that. And I also think that it is useful to have government involved in being sponsors or coordinators of these regulatory systems across different regulatory jurisdictions. Again, we don't operate in isolation. We operate in collaboration with a range of different stakeholders. That's why regulatory systems are so important. And I think we need to also continue our thinking, learn lessons, and follow where there has been good precedence, and New Zealand, again, is a useful example. I would like to compliment the folks in Canberra. I think there's some very good initiatives and thinking coming out of the Department of Finance along these lines, and I would just actively encourage all of you, when you're speaking to politicians, ministers, departmental officials, to encourage them to be involved in this, to be aware of their responsibility. They're not just part of the problem, if there is a problem, which I think there is, and there's 12 of them. They're part of the solution, and we need to make sure that they're co-opted and engaged, because they're an important part of that feedback loop, they're an important part of the structure, they're an important part of making sure that we're doing our jobs effectively and efficiently.
Another great segue for me to mention that our New Zealand colleagues will be attending the conference. For those of you interested, the Ministry of Regulation in New Zealand has a great LinkedIn page that they update regularly with materials that they're producing as part of the journey that they're on. You talked about independence in your answer there, and one of our questions is about that, so it might be a good time to ask. Most regulators would assert that independence is a critical design factor for their success, so that they're not subject to that political influence. Do you think all regulators should be statutory authorities to enable them to be effective?
Well, it depends. And I have a bias towards the answer being yes, but it really does depend on the regulatory objectives. And this is why getting the regulatory objectives is right. The OECD warns against commingling of market development or sector development or economic development mandates or objectives with regulatory functions. Yet many, many regulators around the world and in Australia actually have commingled regulatory objectives that have regulation and some form of development. Now, that's perhaps a conflict. At the very least, it's a competing objective. That's difficult to manage. There is an argument to say that a development or a growth objective is one that is aligned to the government and is not independent. Clearly, and I'm firmly of the view, that when it comes to law enforcement and prosecution, that needs to be independent and free from political interference. But you have many, many, many examples of commingling of enforcement and market development. And again, it's not just me saying that there's a difficulty there, it's the OECD. So the reason why I say that is that that's just an example of independence depends on the regulatory objectives. Again, that's why regulatory objectives are so crucial here. But as I said, my bias is that many functions, pure regulatory functions, should be independent, or at least, to use the helpful New Zealand classification, autonomous. The problem is that most, if not all, regulators outside of central banks are dependent on governments for budget. They're dependent on governments for law enforcement powers, and importantly, senior officials are either appointed by the government and or their reappointment depends on the government themselves. All of these factors go to dilute independence where it exists. And we need, again, to be aware of that, because if we design a regulator and a regulatory system so that the regulator is independent, we need to make sure that that independence is safeguarded. But equally, where we identify that there's objectives or roles or functions that are aligned to government, then we need to be cognizant of that and have governance structures and decision-making structures that allow for that. And thirdly, where we do, by deliberate design, have commingled regulatory functions with non-regulatory functions, and there are many, many, many examples of this, we need to be absolutely crystal clear on internal and external governance mechanisms that allow for you to make decisions, which I call the regulatory dilemma, of what you do with these conflicting and or competing roles and responsibilities and objectives. When you think about it, if you have, which I imagine many of you do, functions or expectations which are both regulatory and non-regulatory, navigating that in tough situations is difficult. You're basically on a hiding to nowhere unless you have good governance, unless you have chains of responsibility back to democratic institutions, and importantly, you have feedback loops and a ways and means, a taxonomy and a framework for measuring effectiveness to explain why you did it and the rationales for doing it.
It's all very helpful and I'm sure relatable advice. One of our online participants has asked us to think about this fourth arm of government in the context of the regulatory profession and the fact that there isn't this professional status through, as strong as there is in other professions. Do you think we need to be certified or licensed as part of building our credibility?
Well, I do think that we need to demonstrate our professionalism. And I've always been a great believer that professionalism is a concept which is very, I think, readily applicable to most functions. So professionalism, or the definition of professionalism that I like, is competence and conscientiousness. When you think about those two concepts, they should be, in our world, readily applicable. Because we are usually experts in our field. I mean, that's usually one of the rationales for setting up a regulator. It's the expert regulator. Malcolm Sparrow speaks about that a lot. So we have the competence. Now, we all think of ourselves as conscientious. In fact, that's one of the issues that we need to understand better about public service motivation. How do your concepts of conscientiousness or values or your definitions of the public interest impact your work? So yes, I do think professionalism is something that can pervade what we do. But what it also speaks to is that I think we need to do a better job as regulatory leaders in understanding how that professionalism, those concepts of competence and conscientiousness manifest themselves in the world of regulation. The public service motivation work that I mentioned in my opening remarks has evolved in recent decades to not just highlight that it's a good thing that we think of ourselves as publicly oriented or have public sector values. It's not just, it's not just good that we are conscientious, but it's also recognised that there's some dark sides of public service motivation, and that is frustrations or lack of coordination and consistency about your value sets and the agency's value sets. And this is why it's very important to recognise that in your regulatory agencies, most people are there because they do have strong public service motivations. They are publicly minded. They have very strong value sets. But unless there is coordination and coalescing of those different value sets, then everyone's going to have their own definition of what they're doing and why they're doing it. This is why I think many people complain about regulators by saying that they're getting inconsistent responses. In part, I think that's because people are applying their own definitions of the public interest or the public value. And that's another thing that regulatory leaders need to think about, not only promoting professionalism, competence and conscientiousness, but promoting a means and a way of coalescing the employment team, the staff team, the officers, the regulatory officers, around an agreed set of public service values. And again, this is why regulatory objectives are so important, because everything flows from there. So not only is regulatory objectives important for credibility, not only is it important for your strategy, not only is it important for decision making, not only is it important for measuring effectiveness, it's also important to make sure that teams internally are motivated and are coalescing around an agreed set of values as opposed to applying their own sets of values, which may be very good and may be perfectly reasonable, but are different or slightly unaligned to what might be the organisation's definition of public service and public value.
Turning our attention again to our regulated entities or duty holders, one of our audience members has asked what you think about asking that regulated population to show how they have improved and changed their practices to meet the objectives and outcomes required by the system.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important part of this concept that I was getting at, that it's both a matter of disincentive and incentive. How can we actually have a collaborative or an engaged way of communicating with the regulated population so that we are actually having a constructive dialogue with them, as I said, not just about, avoiding breaking the law or breaking the norms, but how are you, regulated population, adhering to and advancing the regulatory goals and holding them to account. At the moment, it's all about disincentives. This is my point. It's all about getting the base standard of adherence to the law. What we want, and this is a very Malcolm Sparrow concept, that's the base minimum. What we actually want is good behaviours. We not only want to disincentivize bad behaviours, but we want to incentivise good behaviours. And we do want to have a dialogue with those people involved about, well, how do you get to those good behaviours? What do you need? Are there unintended consequences of the disincentive strategy that are preventing the incentive strategy? And this is complex stuff. But I do agree with the questioner, the premise of the question, but I put it back to all of you as regulators to think about not just the strategy around disincentives, but the strategy for incentivising the positive and good behaviours. Remembering that at the end of the day, we're all in the business of behavioural modification. But if we're in the business of behavioural modification, we have to identify what are those behaviours and what is the conduct that we want to see. And again, all roads lead back to regulatory objectives because that gives us a steer.
Thank you. We're going to wrap up very quickly with one last question, hopefully, so a shorter answer, but we have had a number of questions about the role of regulatory boards, their role in, so maybe if we go at a high level, what do you see as the role of regulatory boards in a system, and in what circumstances do you think they're useful or necessary?
Well, good governance is necessary, and there is no one-size-fits-all governance structure. That's the first point. If you do have a board, it needs to be strategic and it needs to have its oversight responsibilities as its primary goal. Strategy development and effectiveness reviews are a principal goal of a board. They need to make sure that there is clarity of purpose, clarity of strategy, and then create a feedback loop to enable the executive to achieve those goals, that strategy, and be effective. Implicit in what I've just said is to make sure that there is a clear delineation between the oversight and governance function of a board and the executive management and operational function of the executive teams. In my observation, these roles are unfortunately commingled. There needs to be, I think, better delineation of oversight and governance, creating a feedback loop and operational execution and development of those goals by the executive team.
Thank you. You did a great job of answering a big question succinctly there. And I've noticed a lot of people in our audience writing furiously, so I hope you've all found something today that you can take away with you and have a think about how it applies to you in your context. But that is unfortunately all we have time for. So thank you again to James and to our in-person and online audiences for your participation. You're going to shortly receive an evaluation survey and we'd really appreciate it if you could complete it. It does help us to ensure that these events remain relevant. So I need to do a bit of housekeeping wrap-up as well. We want to encourage enrolments for the Professional Regulator Professional Development Programme. It's built by members of the NRCoP in collaboration with RegNet ANU. And if you're keen to hear more, you can check out the ANZOG website for details. Our next local NRCoP event in Adelaide is on May 15th in U City at this location, and it's titled Oceans 6, How 6 Regulators Work Together to Disrupt Unlawful Practices in Massage Parlours in Adelaide CBD. So that promises to be a very interesting discussion, I'm sure. The next national NRCoP event is a hybrid event in Darwin on the 21st of May, and we're going to release details about that soon on our NRCoP events website page. You've heard me plug it a couple of times. Last one, registration is now open for our NRCoP National Conference happening in Meanjin, Brisbane, 27th and 28th of August. We've got some really impressive international speakers and national speakers, and it'd be great for you to think about whether you can come along. Always keep an eye on our LinkedIn page and website pages to keep up to date on our events. We have a really full programme, so it's worthwhile checking back there. And I'd just like to wrap by saying thank you all very much for joining us today.